At a time of great disruption in traditional public education, a new state law promises to accelerate that change. Here to tell us more is Megan Mallicoat, education reporter at Jacksonville Today. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning, Anne.
Glad to have you here, Megan. You've been reporting on this, and there are some big changes just in the past couple of weeks. Catch us up on what has happened just in September and October when it comes to charter schools in the state.
Okay, so what happened first was we'll go just a little further back than that. In the summer, there was some legislation that passed at the end of the state legislative session that changed a program called Schools of Hope. And Schools of Hope is a program in Florida that allows a certain set of charter school operators to come into areas that are served by struggling public schools and open charter schools to try to help the communities there. And so the change that happened in that legislative session was that they required school districts to provide resources basically to allow them to either come into their currently occupied buildings or their vacant buildings or their underutilized buildings, basically anywhere where there was an open seat, and open a charter school in that building, even if it was already in use by an existing traditional public school. And the districts would have to pay for the like the logistical upkeep of that operation, right? And so things like first they couldn't charge rent; they would have to pay for custodial services, some transportation services, um, and all these support services. In September, the Board of Education for the state kind of set that in stone and voted to approve some changes in their policies that were necessary to make all that happen.
So they basically codified this law that had been expanded and changed by the legislature.
Right, right. And so now what we're starting to see is there's a set of 6 Schools of Hope operators that are on the state approved list to do this. And so we've started to see the first round of notifications, basically. They're not requests, they're notifications from these Schools of Hope operators saying we're going to come into these schools and here's where we're going to do it and this is what we're going to do.
And so you broke this story for Jacksonville Today of this one particular applicant, I guess you would call it, or a charter school network that is notifying the Duval County School District that it's coming.
Right. And the reason I say notifications and not, requests or anything like that is because the district does not have a whole lot of recourse to be able to say, no, this is not a good place to locate the school. We'd rather you do it here or somewhere else. They can make a suggestion to ask the school to do it somewhere else, but the school does not have to accept the suggestion. So it's largely just a notification process.
And you did a public records request, and you found that there were 25 of these notifications that had gone out that the Duval County School District received. Where did they get them from?
Right. So they got them from Matter Academy, which is a Miami-based charter school. It's a nonprofit. They're owned by a company that's a for-profit, but they received them from this Matter Academy. And the reason we started looking at Jacksonville was because they were going out to districts across the state. And 25 was just an astronomical number. So we've heard of districts in Central Florida getting maybe 2 and 3 notifications at a time. But there's a very small number that got a large number of notifications, and Duval's among them.
Is there anything that you can see in the way of a pattern between the counties that are getting more than 24 notifications from Matter Academy that Matter Academy is coming to their district?
So I think it comes down to the large urban districts. We've got Broward getting, I think they said somewhere around 25 or 30, and Hillsborough County getting 25 or 30, and now Duval getting 25. And those districts both have more traditional public schools than Duval, but they're right up there in the set of the state's top.
So
districts.
how big of a impact would that have on the school footprint in Duval County, and what kind of schools are they targeting?
I think that it's hard to say exactly what the impact would be at this point, but we can speculate some possibilities just based on the numbers that it would change. And so Matters notices specify that if you add them up, they had an attendance or enrollment projection for each school. If you add them up, it's about 11,000 students, which is a lot of students. The district enrolls about maybe 10 or 110, 112,000 in its traditional public schools already. So that's a fairly significant chunk of its enrollment. And from the state, districts get about $9,000 in pure per student funding. So if you multiply that across, I think it stands to reason that it's possible that the district loses almost $100 million just in student funding for these schools, but still have to keep the schools going in order to serve the populations that they're already serving.
And the idea of the population is that this would be drawn from existing public schools. Is that right?
I mean, I would think so. They could come from students that are currently attending private schools. They could come from students who are already attending other charter schools. Um, but I think that the most likely candidate is students who are enrolled in schools that are, hyper local to the areas where these schools are starting to form. So you also have cases like, so one of the schools that was on the list was Annie Morgan Elementary, which closed at the end of last school year, so 6 months ago or so. And in that neighborhood, it closed because it consolidated with Biltmore Elementary, which is also on the list actually. But the district closed it because they no longer had the funds to maintain both of these schools, which were relatively small and under-enrolled, and they're close together, a mile or two apart. So they consolidated those two schools into Biltmore, and now you have your building for Annie Morgan that's sitting there unused and vacant. And so if a charter school moves into that building, you may have students who liked going to that school because it was in their neighborhood.
Oh, sure.
It's a school that's in their neighborhood that choose to go there. So it may pull from students that the district may have otherwise wanted to send to one of their consolidated schools.
Interesting. If you are just joining us, we're talking to Jacksonville Today education reporter Megan Mallicoat about the local impact of the new statewide Schools of Hope expansion. If you've got questions or comments, you can join our conversation. You can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or X at FCC On Air. And you can, of course, watch our live stream on the WJCT Public Media YouTube channel. Megan, it would be helpful to just remind folks, what are charter schools?
Sure. Charter schools essentially are publicly funded, privately operated schools. And so the state still provides funding just in the same way that the funding comes from the state to your local neighborhood elementary school. But instead, in this case, it goes to charter schools, and it's not bound by some of the same policies and procedures that like say in this case, Duval Schools would have for its schools. There are some laws that come from the state that it has to follow. But they're not as closely regulated as some of as your traditional public schools would be.
And they are, one big difference is that the Duval County School District is run by an elected school board.
Mhm.
And the school board, they do have boards at charter schools, but they are not elected, they're appointed. And they are not necessarily perhaps accountable then in the same way. What are other ways that charter schools are different?
Um, so some of them will have a special focus on a topic that they like. You see some charter schools that focus on a curriculum that's maybe I don't know. Someone once was nature based, so maybe works on getting the kids to focus on these things, or you have some that are certainly more conservative driven. You could have some that are, in theory, more driven by policies that the other political side would appreciate as well. Um, but I think the most compelling difference is simply that they're not part of the regular public school system. I mean, I know that the funding comes from it, but you have these small boards that run these individual schools, or smaller boards that run these networks of schools, and um, it it simply becomes different than the neighborhood schools within the traditional public school system.
We've got a call from Kendra in Mandarin. Good morning, Kendra. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann. So, two of the problems with charter schools, of which there are many, are funding and dislocate. Let me start over. One of the problems is that after we do the 10-day count in public schools, the money follows the kids. So if the kids have gone to a charter school, the money follows them. Another problem is the lack of services. That's the second problem. Charter schools have very little accountability. That's a third very serious problem. And if the kids are not getting the gifted special needs or other services that they require, or for any reason are dissatisfied, when they return to the public school, those funds do not follow them back. And so we kind of have a revolving door with the kids but not with the funds. So we're
They
losing a lot.
they don't follow them back that school year, but I would imagine the following school year, they would certainly follow them,
The
yes?
following school year, it could, but you're absolutely right. Is that so? If you think of that, we have this system in society where all school or all students, all children are is education is a right, right? So all we guarantee that children can have education, but the public school, the traditional public school system, is like the foundational side. So if they might go to charter school, but the charter school has ways of not, if the kid doesn't fit their model, they can choose to not enroll them. Private schools obviously don't have to pick any student that they don't want to. Public schools are the foundation that is obligated to educate any child, no matter what the special differences or difficult circumstances are. And if a child does go to a charter school, and you do the 10-day count, and so the money then is sent to the charter
The
school
10-day count being, like, at the start of the
at
school
the
year.
start of the school year. I think they also do it then again at the after the holiday break in the middle of the school year. But then so you are potentially left with a situation where the student then re-enrolls in the public school system and has to be educated because the public school system is obligated to do so. But then the money actually went to the other school, and they don't get it for that child for us, an extended period of time.
I mean, one of the things in terms of the money and that you have reported on in Jacksonville Today is the fact that this law requires schools, as they accommodate the charters, to potentially provide services for those co-located schools. And that could include everything from custodial services to busing to cafeteria services. So it's possible that the money could follow the student from the traditional public school to the charter school that's co-located there, but the traditional public school would still be paying all of those costs for that student.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot that's still somewhat unclear as to how this would even work, because if you think of something like transportation, the state doesn't fund transportation at 100%. It funds it at about
30%.
30%. And so is the district then going to be on the hook for busing these kids that aren't even enrolled in their actual schools for the additional 60%? I don't know. That's
We've got a call from Yasmina in Arlington. Good morning, Yasmina. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for covering this bad policy, bad legislation. I just wanted to reference that this is a complete hostile takeover to our public schools, our traditional public schools, our charter schools. I like to call them as squatters, is what they're going to try to be doing in our traditional public schools. And I just want to remind the community listening to this that we really need to come together and combat this really bad legislation the same way we did when there was the AP funding cuts. People need to be emailing their state legislators, and they need to be emailing their board members. We all have a collective responsibility in ensuring that every student has access to education.
Thanks, Yasmina. We also have a call from Tom on the west side. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning. Yes, I think this thing is ridiculous. It's just an illegal subsidy of one school that favors it over all the others that are going to have to be making all the payments for rent and utilities and everything else. The only thing this school is paying for is staff. And yeah, hopefully the other charters that compete with this one will sue and maybe get this changed, because, like I say, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Thanks, Tom. Megan, somebody had quoted in one of the stories on this in another publication, someone comparing it to as if Lowe's had to allow Home Depot to come in and, pay for their rent and sell their material from, but in terms of the money, right now the school district is facing something like $100 million shortfall. And they've been doing this, this very difficult and painful process of closing and consolidating schools because they're trying to save money. Are these buildings that are now being vacated due to consolidations, are those buildings that the school district had planned to sell and make money from? Or what happens to that if there's a vacant building that's created by this financial necessity and then the charter school comes in and begins operating there?
That is an excellent question, and I don't think that we have a clear determination of what the outcome would be there yet. But it's certainly something that needs to be addressed, because that is the case here in Duval, and I would imagine it's the case around the state as well. That our district has been in the process of trying to sell some of these buildings that are now vacant. It's not a quick process because nothing in government moves quickly.
Right.
So they have to declare the buildings as surplus and then go through a process that just takes some time in order to offload the buildings. And they're in the middle of this process for several of these buildings. Um, so I honestly don't know if this means that they have to put that process on pause and allow Matter to come in and open a school in these buildings that the district had already deemed were not in good shape and not worth renovating, too expensive to continue to operate. Does that mean that the district then has to pay for renovations in order for them to be inhabited by children? I don't know. It's an excellent question.
There's another question that's been raised in terms of, school districts that are growing, which is not really the problem that Duval has had as much. But, there are a lot of counties that are experiencing a lot of growth. If a county builds a school and it's not fully at occupancy, and therefore it's not counted as a fully occupied school, which opens it up to this Schools of Hope um, possibility. Is it possible that a school is kind of built in anticipation of a growing student population, that it could be kind of co-occupied by a charter school until that happens?
I would think so, the way that the legislation reads. But again, that's a great question too. So we saw our neighboring county in St. John's, who's an example of a very fast growing county. They received one letter from Matter Academy to use the building. I believe it was First Coast Technical, and would that be something that they would, St. John's doesn't often build schools that then have all this extra space in it because of their overcrowding problem, but I suppose that in theory it could. The law requires the districts to send out a report at certain time intervals saying where their extra space is, and so that these Schools of Hope operators can like sign up for it, I guess. So I don't, in theory, it could.
Part of this expansion, I mean, the idea behind the original Schools of Hope was, as you said, to kind of go into low performing districts, provide options for parents, an alternative of some kind, or perhaps a focus that would, allow some kids at those underperforming schools to find a niche that allowed them academic success. One of the things that changed in this last legislative session was sort of a broader definition of what constitutes a school, that a school from Hope can kind of move in and operate alongside.
Right. It's if you look back, so the program started about a decade ago, a little less, with $140 million influx of cash to provide extra funding to schools that needed it in these certain areas that needed help. So at first it was also open to public schools. And so if you look into Jacksonville, there was some school in Arlington that applied for these grants, basically didn't receive it. But now you have a School of Hope operated by Idea Public Schools that's literally just down the street from where this elementary school was. And I mean, I suppose that it makes sense to want to provide some extra funding to these schools that need help in these areas. But the process and the procedures have shifted away from that model towards a model that's simply charter school operators.
We have a question from Anita on Facebook. She's saying, appointed members of boards of charter schools. Is this information available to the public? The membership, the board membership of a charter school, like a public school, is publicly available. They're not always necessarily a close. They sometimes are managed on a regional basis.
Sometimes. And so charter schools, because they are publicly funded, are still subject to the same public records laws that our government entities and public schools are. However, because they don't run through the same system through the district, it can be much more difficult to get the records. They're not.
It's difficult to get the records from the district anyway.
I mean that's true. Yes.
As you found.
Yes. So even a layer even more difficult beyond that. In that they don't have some of the same obligations to report to these central central data places and things like that.
And they may not be familiar with public records law in quite the in quite the same way. They don't receive perhaps as many requests and maybe aren't accustomed to processing them.
That's right. But in theory, yes, the boards should be public. They, in often case, and the ones that are regionally run, they'll have regional boards. And then many times the school itself will have a board of locals.
Yeah. Ricardo emailed, this is just the last step in the long path towards privatization of public goods and services. Teacher unions and everyone else who is paying attention pointed this out when they started passing charter school and school choice laws. Remember Mr. Corcoran, the charter school executive turned state senator, turned education secretary, follow the money, and forget about the kids. Megan, there is, a money aspect to this because, as you said, a lot of these charters are operated by nonprofits, but often those nonprofits are operated by for-profit entities that are often making a substantial profit through the essential privatization of public education.
Right. So that creates an interesting trail of money to follow. In this case, Matter is part of a for-profit company called Academica that has been around about about the same amount of time of Florida school choice programs in the state. It was founded right in the late 90s. And so it certainly creates some interesting financial transactions to investigate.
And not always easy to trace as
No.
like a lot of, you know, activity in the sphere of public financing of campaigns and such. A lot of that money is dark money. A lot of that money is moved through various entities, and it's a little hard to track.
Right. So you see things like donations from some of the companies moving to some PACs, moving to other companies moving back to PACs and candidates, and it does create a very circular trail.
I want to ask you about the projections for growth that Matter has put forth in some of these districts where they've said what their expectation is within a 5-year period. It would suggest, at least in some districts, that their projections would be to basically absorb the entire population of the school that they are co-locating in. So in essence, that they would begin operating in a school and within that 5-year period, at least have that same number of students that are currently in that school.
Right, or certainly they would have maybe more than 50% of the students that are using the resources in that school. So when it comes time to sharing things like the cafeteria and the gym and all these other resources that are like common areas to the students, that the public school, the traditional public school, is supposed to share equally with the charter school. If they actually have more students enrolled, then I'm not sure what that does to our kids in traditional public school. But yeah, their projected enrollment numbers are quite high and compared to the overall capacity of the buildings.
In addition to following your great reporting on Jacksonville Today, what do you think parents should be paying attention to in this conversation?
I would look to this, the list of schools, which we have on Jax Today in our original article about it, the list of schools, and it's quite possible that a school in your area is impacted, and that would, of course, impact the way that your children are.
Yeah. And you also, point out where those schools are and, the fact that they would largely impact north and northwest side of the district, which is important to note. There's a lot there. Megan Mallicoat, you're doing great reporting as usual. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Ann.